So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Today, inshallah, we're going to be continuing our tafsir. Let's just go over what we did last time really quick. We're not going to do a lot of talking about that because it's a revision right there. وقالوا ما في بطون هذه الأنعام خالصة لذكورنا ومحرم على أزواجنا. The main concept of this ayah and the ayah before it is that they were making their own legislation. They were making their own legislation based on their price. In other words, it was a human resource based on their speculation. It was based on their own imagination of what legislation or what spirituality or what would make justice. And certainly they had gone wrong, one, in their resource. Two, the data that they had basically thought that they had fully understood. And number three, certainly the interpretation had totally gone wrong. And of course, leading to one, the killing of their own children, two, the maldistribution in the property, or at least in the wealth that they had. Maldistribution led to social injustice, and certainly, of course, at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exposing their resource by exposing the injustice, whether the social injustice or whether that was the economical injustice, and the list goes on and on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exposing their resource by basically exposing the injustices that they had led to. This is extremely important. We talked about that sometimes you would want to discuss and refute the different falsehoods by looking sometimes at the consequence and what this led to, in order to take them all the way back to talking to them about the resource. So, and sometimes you're going to flip it the other way, that this resource is what you're going to discuss and basically scrutinize the resource in order to have them see that this resource contains its own discrepancies, contains its own contradictions, etc., in order to let them see farther later on with the resource and what it contains, and how this had led to the social injustice, the maldistribution, or whatever it is, so that you're going to be basically exposing. Okay, so this is in order to help us see what is the concept, what is the aim, and what does the Quran want to teach us in looking at that paradigm. And we learned the main concept was to expose the Jahiliyyah in order to get them to Tawheed. The whole concept of Quran in exposing all of this is not to lay out some historical facts or traditions or culture, and to talk about their culture as if it was some kind of a pioneer or something to be to celebrate in whatever way. Absolutely not. This was to expose the Jahiliyyah and what it led to, and how the confusion in their Tawheed really led them to lots of losses. And this is the same thing when we speak about even writing. I'd like to mention that one. I had a question a couple of days ago. Someone asked me about the ruling in writing things such as, for example, maybe magic, or perhaps relations, romantic books, or anything of that sort, or perhaps even fairy tale gods and goddesses and all of these different things. What is the ruling on that? I'd like to just mention a couple things. Number one, learning from the Quran, we learn when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about whether the different gods that the other nations had worshipped, or whether the type of social injustice that they had committed, or even the type of romantic relations that they had done, just like Qawm Lut, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or even the magic that Fir'aun, the Fir'aun community was doing, all of that was exposed with one mission, with one aim, and that is to expose whether the impunity, or whether to expose the contradiction, or whether to expose the harm of such acts, the harm and what it leads to, and how it leads to corruption, or how it leads to basically creating haram things in the society, injustice, the list goes on and on. So in that situation, to write about it, that would be permissible. But if we are writing about, let's say, a romantic novel, but it's just to make sale and using this romantic relationship type of book and using it as a way to celebrate or to bring basically a form of bringing in more people to see it as if it's something that is glorified, then in that way, that would definitely be haram, no doubt and no question. We also talked about the story, and we kind of went in detail with the story, but we said it doesn't have a chain of narration. But does that mean that the whole thing is basically disproving that infanticide existed within the Jahiliyyah community, or the pre-prophetic era, or that time? Does that mean it doesn't exist? No, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but we're talking about the story itself. We don't have a chain of narration to basically prove the validity of the details of such story. But that doesn't mean that such things did not exist. That doesn't necessarily mean that the story did not happen. We just don't have the evidence to prove that it necessarily happened in such detail. So we don't have the evidence to scrutinize the chain of narration to basically prove that it was authentic or something that was not authentic. Okay. In other words, we can use it to explain something in tafsir, but we cannot use it to basically use it as an evidence to legislate any matter. Okay, just keep that one in mind. So we can use it. This is why, for example, Qurtubi had mentioned it as something that we would call al-isti'nas. So it's something to get the inspiration from, something to learn from, something to at least keeping records of, but not necessarily as something to use as in legislation. That's why al-Qurtubi himself was aware of that, and he used the word ruwiya, which basically is a passive voice to tell us, well, we're not really sure we know or we have the chain of narration, but it was mentioned as such. And we talked about the story. But of course, if we were to summarize what we did last time, we just said it right there. It is to expose the resource and basically show them all the consequences of maldistribution, injustice that their shirk had led to. This is extremely important. So that's the same thing. If you were to want to perhaps expose secularism, you're going to say, okay, this is the injustice that it had committed on the economical side. This is how it resulted in, let's say, more single parents, or perhaps the liberalism, more single parents, or probably the increase in let's say, numbers of people that are rich versus the numbers of people that are poor, probably getting poorer and poorer. Yes, you can probably call that capitalism, but you're also talking about, let's say, all the different types of culture that secularism had brought, whether we're speaking about, of course, perhaps the single parents and the injustice, the social injustice. We're talking about more children that are fatherless. We're speaking about what that leads, and perhaps a good study or good podcast someone might do is bring specialists that would talk about exposing the secular system and how it led to the increase of violence and domestic violence, or children outside of wedlock, children, and what it results and what it and how it affects them to be born with your father basically not known to you, and what it leads to, and what kind of anxiety does that lead to. So what are we then doing? We're exposing the system in a different way. So we're exposing not necessarily the word secularism, but we're exposing the implications of it in order to help people recognize that this is the injustice that it had led to, and therefore helping people find guidance through Tawheed and through the methods of Islam. For example, okay, this isn't exclusive to that, but since we're talking about Jahiliyyah here, can we do something similar perhaps in Islam? And or in our times, in our modern times, can we expose secularism in different ways and show the implications that it had on the society and how it led to 1, 2, 3 injustices, or 4 even more injustices, or even the harm on economical scale, or perhaps some social scale, and the list goes on and on. And that way it'll help people recognize, by exposing all of this, recognize that this really started from those thoughts that had led us to all of this impunity, all of this injustice, all of this harm within the society, and look what we are now harvesting. That's basically what the Quran wanted to say, and certainly that's one way to learn part of the methods for doing da'wah. So think of it as a paradigm for doing da'wah, to basically help us recognize that this is one method to use, is to expose what the implications of shirk, or even perhaps we're talking about maybe atheism, maybe feminism, or perhaps individualism, and all these different things, and what the implication it has on our society, and how it led to 1, 2, 3, 4 injustices, or the implication exposed, in order to help people recognize that, look at the life that this had led us to, and therefore to help them recognize guidance. Okay, so that's those ayat in a nutshell. Then let's continue. وهو الذي أنشأ جنات معروشات وغير معروشات والنخل والزرع مختلفا أكله. Let's look into this ayah first before we go in details with al-Qurtubi. He's the one that created, or the word أنشأ actually means to bring into creation out of nothing. So أنشأ, خلق, that's basically to let us know something was created out of nothing. جنات معروشات, various gardens that are معروشات and غير معروشات. So this is basically the opposite. Okay, what is معروشة? معروشة comes from the word عرش, which basically means to sit on something. Okay, so معروشات is talking about some plants that would either be in a position where they are just growing on the ground. I don't know what those plants are called. Okay, they would be grown on ground, and you would have the option to probably create perhaps like a bridge for it, or some kind of a what would they call that, like a something to basically hold it up. So you're creating something to let it start building its nesting basically up, just like, for example, grape trees. If you were to leave them on the floor, they'll just continue expanding on the floor. But if you were to build for it something like we would, in Arabic we call it arisha, at least in the Levant area we call it arisha. So you're building something. English is failing me. I don't know an equivalent word for that, but I could say, if you can help me on the chat, give me an equivalent word that basically is giving me kind of like a bridge and helping basically this grape leaf tree go, or this grape tree basically go up and start growing in a way that basically is upwards. Okay, so that's ma'rusha. غير ma'rusha, in other words, it doesn't actually grow that way. It just grows in a way that doesn't need this type of expansion in that way, but it basically is growing either short on the ground or probably growing like a tree, like an apple tree. So that's غير معروشات. Okay, so why is that even important? Like, why give me معروشات and غير معروشات? It's basically to let us know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us various plantations, various things that you would see on earth in order to give you the rizq. The rizq is not exclusive to one single harvest, but is actually in different forms. One is to give you perhaps maybe more shade, to give you coolness, etc. And what the other type is to basically let it off the ground, to keep it clean, to keep it healthy for you, and basically let it standing. Okay. والنخل والزرع مختلفا أكله. And النخل are basically palm trees. الزرع is all the different kinds of plants. Are we talking about produce, and are we talking about what type of زرع, what type? Nothing specific. It's basically الزرع. In Lugha Arabiya, you've got the al, which can be an inclusive al and can be a specifying al. Okay, so this az-zar' is not specifying, but it's actually called istighraqiyya. So it's just letting you know that there are multiple and various plants that are out there that basically have mukhtalifan ukuluhu, that basically have multiple tastes. والزيتون والرمان. So wait a minute, is zaytun, isn't that the olive trees? Yes, those are olives, and the ruman are pomegranates. متشابهة وغير متشابه. They're similar and they are various, like variant types. Okay, so what are we talking about here? So aren't they included in az-zara'? Aren't they included in the plants? Why speak about the different types of this? Yes, this is for barakah. It's to, sometimes you say there are many plants, but then you would then indicate one particular plant and let it stand out, sometimes to show its importance, sometimes to show a certain blessing, sometimes it's basically to bring as something that stands out amongst all of those plants, for example, stands out in all the different elements, or probably the healing probably elements in it, or perhaps the barakah and the different blessings that we can't just include it in all the plants like that, but we got to emphasize a certain importance. So that's okay, so she gave me the trellis. Is that how I read it? I don't know what that, I don't even know how to read it. Okay, so I think she's giving me about the ma'rushat. Okay. I don't know how to read it. She gave me the word for it. Trellised. That's probably ma'rushat. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Okay, I don't know how to read it. So if you can read it for me, go ahead. Okay. Kulu min okay, hold on. متشابه وغير متشابه. What is متشابه? متشابه meaning that they are similar. So we would have simply certain trees that basically are similar in taste, similar in kind, and similar in the way that they probably grow, etc. And غير متشابه. And some are different. كلوا من ثمره إذا أثمر. Eat from it when it ripes. وآتوا حقه يوم حصاده. And pay its duty on the day of its harvest. ولا تسرفوا, and do not exceed the limit, for he does not like those that would exceed the limit, called al-musrifin. We're going to go in details with that. ومن الأنعام حمولة وفرشا. And from al-an'am, from the animals, al-an'am are cattle, camel, goats, and sheep. Those are al-an'am. So they're all herbivore animals. They were animals that, at least within that society, that's what they ate. Does that mean herbivore animals elsewhere are not permissible to eat? No, it is permissible to eat herbivore animals in general. Let's make the story short. Herbivore animals are in general permissible to eat. Certain animals, they debated if they are considered as basically animals that we can consume, or whether they are animals that grow on filth, or what are they. And you want to keep in mind that some of that debate, which animals can we eat and which animals are we not supposed to be eating, there was a lot of cultural influence in there. Okay, just keep that one in mind. There's no question that carnivore animals, other than sea animals, are permissible to eat, are impermissible to eat. So lions, tigers, bears, etc., impermissible to eat. They're carnivore animals that you cannot eat. Okay, there's no question about that. Same thing with carnivore animals or carnivore birds. They're not permissible to eat. So there's no question about that. Okay, but then they debated animals that may be considered ambivores. We're talking about animals that are part sea or living partly on water and partly on land. So we're talking about things like alligators. Are we permitted to eat alligators? Well, they're carnivores, but they're living part of their life on sea and part of their life are on land. Should we consider that as a sea animal, or is that not a sea animal? Is that a land animal? What do we consider those? Those were a place of question. Okay, so just keep that one in mind, a place of question. And yes, ironically, I would say ironically, because I don't know, I thought it was no question at one point whether we're permitted to eat alligators, especially that, you know, you cannot question that they have a canine tooth. There's no question about that. But well, so do sharks, right? So do sharks. They have canine teeth. Are you not going to eat that too? I thought it was a sea animal. Yeah, it's a sea animal. So that's permissible to eat? Yes, that's permissible to eat. Okay, but it has a canine tooth. Yes, but it's الحل ميتة الطهور ماؤه والحل ميتته. الطهور ماؤه. The sea animals are the water is basically pure, and the animals are even if dead, unless they were floating dead, starting to decompose, that's a different story. Okay, but if we're not talking about starting and showing signs of that they are decomposing, then in that situation you can actually consume them. Okay, but here it wanted to show women al-an'ami hamulatan wa farsha. So some hamula, basically letting us know that some they can be used as a form of transportation. To carry your items, and some of it is basically something that you can not use as a form of transportation, but it is basically farsha. You could use it as a form to, oh dear, I lost the page, hold on, as a form of basically using their wool perhaps to create your own mattresses, or perhaps use it for clothing, basically garments, clothing, or probably mattresses, something that would carry you. So you could either one use it as a way for transportation, or you could use it as a form of covering and basically to help you in that way. كلوا مما رزقكم الله. كلوا مما رزقكم الله. Eat from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you as provisions. And do not follow the steps of shaitan. إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌ مُبِينٌ. He is basically a clear enemy. Okay, so here are a couple questions here. What does this ayah and these ayat have to do with the previous ayat? So we were looking at the previous ayat, and we were saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know the falsehood within that shirk by exposing all the different injustices and all the different harmful things that it had led to. why would it right now tell us وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنشَأَ جَنَّاتٍ مَعْرُوشَاتٍ? It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala letting us know that if you are looking at your gods, we're talking about basically the mushrikeen, if you're seeing what your gods, what your religion and the lifestyle that it had led to was nothing but limiting your resources to putting an end and eliminating basically your family members and causing you to basically live in distress. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically then telling us, well, on the other hand, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Tawheed is letting you see all the different blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the different types of vegetation, the different types of plants that you could use as resources to, one, give you more than just food, but also give you covering, or even the way that it was laid out was to actually give you honor. Why did it talk about marushat wa ghayra marushat? It's to let you see that the plant wasn't just thrown on the floor. No, it was some of it. Yes, some of those plants you would eat the root. It's basically potatoes, carrots, you would eat the root. Okay, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wanting you to recognize that you were honored as a human being, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let that honor basically be something that is lifted for you. It is lifted where you could lift those plants up so you could see those grapes. If they were to grow on the floor, they were going to get mushed. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let you realize that in order to let it not get mushed and be something that is basically good for you to eat, it was created in a way to give you multiple benefits. One, to give you a shade, and two, it was to give you basically also something that is to give you honor. And غَيْرَ مَعْرُوشَاتٍ, it's standing to help you basically reach to it in a way that lets you recognize that the rizq is high up. It's basically up there and not necessarily something that you would see always on the floor. There is some rizq on the floor, there's no doubt. Some of the rizq is on the floor. We're looking at mushrooms, you would find that on the floor. You're looking at perhaps even underground, like we had mentioned, beets and probably carrots and probably, just different items that more other plants that you would basically grow on ground, and they would be really short. We're talking about cauliflower, perhaps of course cabbage, etc. Okay, والنخل والزرع. And nakhl, that's also to let us see just different types of plants. But here's the question. When it said كُلُوا مِن ثَمَرِهِ إِذَا أَثْمَرَ, once it ripens, eat it. وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ, and give its right on the day of harvest. I mean, of course, we're going to eat it once we see it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that once it ripes, that basically is to tell you that it had reached the maximum amount of its benefit. But that's not the only thing. No, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ, it's letting you know that you have a duty to pay for when you harvest it, a duty to pay whether in zakat or whether in donation. In other words, you eat an amount that is not excessive, even though the amount of plantation is going to be a large amount, and even though the large amount is going to be available for you, one tree can actually give you tons of kilos, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا. Just because you see it in abundant amount, that does not mean you would exceed the limit. So what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us here? That certainly they had put, that is the people of Ayyam al-Jahiliyyah, the time of Jahiliyyah, they had put the restrictions, but those restrictions were basically to cancel out certain people, to basically not allow or restrict other people from eating it, basically the women here, or it was to cancel out the actual rizq, the actual provision. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that no, they're in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically asking you to do just two things, or two things. Number one, He's giving you the rizq to enjoy. Number two, you basically have two responsibilities. Number one is that you're going to recognize that the amount of harvest that you had, that you're going to share it with those that are in need. Why? Because certainly that rizq was given to you, but that rizq is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so you're paying basically from that rizq, and you recognize that it was given to other people as well. In other words, this rizq is not just for you, but this rizq is enough to be for all people and for others that are basically on earth. So atu haqqahu yawma hasadih. So what are you doing here? You're basically removing all this feeling that you basically contain everything, you deserve it all to yourself, and you're removing this selfishness and sharing it, basically sharing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you with others. The other one is وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا. Even if you have that amount, you basically do not exceed the limit in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asked you to basically use as the right amount for you. We're going to go in details with the word لَا تُسْرِفُوا, because what could be israf for you may not be israf for someone else. So what is the limit? If I were to probably, I don't know, buy a Lamborghini, it would be israf for me, because $428,000 is definitely too expensive for me for a car. But who knows? Maybe Latifa, she's a billionaire, and $428,000, oh, that's basically just nothing but pennies to her. But that's probably all my wealth, and even more than my wealth for a Lamborghini. All right. So in that situation, that would be israf for me, but not israf for her. So what is that limit? What is the standard? What is the reference that I would go to understand and to help me basically learn whether this is israf, whether this is acceptable, or whether this isn't acceptable for my case? Okay, so stay tuned. We're going to talk about that in not today, at least tomorrow, inshallah, or the day the coming days. إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ, for he does not like those that are musrifin. We're going to get in details with the word sa, ra, fa, and what it means. وَمِنَ الْأَنْعَامِ حَمُولَةً وَفَرْشًا. So the question is, in terms of al-an'am, he said two restrictions. لا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان. Actually, one restriction right there, but it would actually go with the musrifin too. And do not follow the footsteps of shaitan. So why is it when he talked about the plants, he put a restriction of one, you're not going to eat with a certain amount of abundance and waste, and that we're supposed to be giving the right of donation in terms of when we harvest it. But in terms of al-an'am, he said, do not follow the footsteps of shaitan. So what does that mean? When we eat animals, this might actually make us somehow get the traits of shayateen? No. Okay, so why did it say وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ? Well, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, because the people of Quraysh, they were using their own definition of legislation in how to deal with the animals. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that al-an'am, when you slaughter it, you have to recognize that there are certain methods to slaughter the animal and to make any type of a restriction that is baseless and is not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had legislated, that's following the footsteps of shaitan. So what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala letting us know? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that the restrictions that you will put is basically coming from shaitan, unless it's a restriction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put. What's the counterpart of it? The counterpart is how the mushrikeen of Quraysh, they had made their own restrictions in regards to animals, who deserves to eat from it, who's not allowed to eat from it. How do we understand what this animal probably might mean in any form of sanctity, and creating our own rituals based on these animals, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. You would see that, of course, even in terms of animals, you would see a lot of religions basically were surrounded around certain animals, because they had seen that animals had some sort of a divine power, just like Hinduism, some sort of a divine power, and had seen that it was the cattle, it was the cattle that basically had given them power, given them life, given them the resources, etc. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting people know that shirk and exaggerating the power within animals is a form that had led many to make shirk out of it. Same thing if you were to look at the pharaohs, they were glorifying snakes. Same thing if you were to look at the Native Americans, they had considered that everything about nature, that everything about birds, things in nature, at least some tribes, that they basically contained the power of God, or the power that basically brought life, So they basically related to animals and so forth, and gave them a specific type of empowerment, and considered that that's basically a way to find God, that through animals and things through nature. So it's just like, for example, Zen as well. So you have multiple religions that basically see animals as a sign of God. And certainly, was that necessarily the human beings themselves inventing their own religion / deviation, or was that not necessarily their own religion, their own selves? Basically, was that something that was inspired by Shaitan himself? So it can be both. It can be both. So a deviation that man himself can create, or Shaitan inspired, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that وَإِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ لَا يُوحُونَ إِلَىٰ أَوْلِيَائِهِمْ, that is, shayateen can inspire their followers. They would inspire their followers. And of course, زُخْرُفَ الْقَوْلِ غُرُورًا, they give them a certain narrative. They're beautified in a way to make it seem acceptable, to make it seem like it's a noble act, to make it seem desirable for the people to believe in all of this. Okay, so that's خطوات الشيطان. So why compared to the plants? He didn't say the same. Number one, like we said, is to basically bring the contrast of what the people of Quraysh were doing. Number two, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, can give us an inspiration as well, that by eating animals, that we may also get certain traits from eating animals. So you would see, it's quite interesting, Yaqut al-Hamawi. Okay, let me tell you about Yaqut al-Hamawi. Like for his name, al-Hamawi, basically from Hama. Okay, and same thing, Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was from, well, he was from Tunisia, but to be honest, I think Tunisians exaggerate that they're going to hate me for this. Okay. My husband is Tunisian, but they're going to hate me for this, but that's okay. Tunisians, you had taken the Palestinian daughter as basically to marry your son. So accept it from me. Okay. All right. Let's see what happened. Ibn Khaldun originally is really from Al-Andalus, but lived in Tunisia. Sorry, Tunisians. I know you guys have this sculpture of Ibn Khaldun, and you guys are so, infatuated with Ibn Khaldun being Tunisian, all of that, but he's actually originally from Al-Andalus. You know what that means? At the end, one of the great ulama. Okay, now to make the story short, Yaqut al-Hamawi and Ibn Khaldun, they give this ironic indication that you can see from the types of animals that people eat, you may see certain traits. And they also got that from the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ had ordered the Sahaba who, when he had said, whoever had eaten from the camel meat, that they should redo their wudu. And some scholars debated whether eating camel meat can actually develop into you some certain features of jinn-like features, or is it features of probably betraying others, or probably, because when you look at certain animals, you would see camels, for example, they would never forget their enemy, and they will attack a person if that person harmed them. They'll never forget their enemy, and they will attack. They will bite. They will attack. They will step on somebody. They're even willing to sit on that person until they die. Okay, so the one thing that you don't know about camels. Okay, versus when you look at sheep, for example, they have completely different traits than goats. Sheep, they're extremely stupid. I mean, I lived on a farm, okay, completely stupid. They can lead all the herd into a really dangerous steep, and then everybody just, on all of them, they won't even realize that, hey, somebody just died from here, let me turn away. Versus the goats, they would raise their head up and they'd be looking all around, and they won't even accept to eat from the ground. No, they go way up, and they would all be climbing those trees. They're basically looking. Okay, you would say the traits of goats are completely different than the traits of sheep, for example. The traits of cows, they're extremely different. Okay, so some scholars like Yaqut al-Hamawi, Ibn Khaldun, and even others, they basically considered that the type of vegetation or the type of meat is going to speak a lot of who you really are. I'll give you an ironic thing. I think it was Yaqut al-Hamawi. He had actually mentioned about Algerians. Okay, since we've got an Algerian sister here. Algerians and Moroccans, they were one nation. It's really strange how sometimes they would actually think, we're supposed to be racing and competing with one another. That's nothing but that colonialism that basically developed such animosity. We're one nation. Okay, so he was talking about their extreme patience. Okay, extreme patience, and how patient and how a perseverance that they had developed, and he said that was also coming, at least in certain areas, that was coming from certain plants that they were eating, and that was itini shoki, basically the I don't know what teen shoki is in English, to be honest. It's sabr, like cactus. That was coming from the cactus trees, and they were really patient. And he was also thinking that, especially Yaqut al-Hamawi, Yaqut al-Hamawi considered that certain areas in Morocco, because in Algeria, because they're living in mountainous areas. Same thing with the Kurds. He said the living in mountainous areas basically developed certain features of toughness, certain features of might, certain features of patience and perseverance, versus when he talked about other areas that were like plateaus type of thing, it was affecting them differently. They were easy, sometimes too easy, and sometimes didn't have the same type of perseverance. So whether we're speaking about the terrain in a certain area, or whether the type of vegetation that they were eating, and whether it's I guess, containing lots of water. So he would look at Bilad al-Sham and talk about Bilad al-Sham completely in a completely different way compared to speaking about a desert area like Libya, for example. He would talk about it. It's completely different description, and talk about that. Well, this is probably related to the abundance in water in this area versus the scarcity of water in this area, developed a certain behavioral feature, perhaps. And the same thing, they were to also get وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, that this isn't to say that we are supposed to be vegetarians whatsoever, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically taught us كُلُوا مِمَّا رَزَقَكُمُ اللَّهُ, eat from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you in terms of rizq. So he was basically indicating that eating al-an'am is basically something that is good for us. It's basically rizq, it's basically provision, etc. Now, what if somebody were to say that they are vegetarian because they felt that that slaughtering animals was cruel? That's going to be kufr. Kufr. Why would you say it's kufr? I mean, they just thought it was cruel. Yeah, but well, you are right now inferring that Islam was permitting something that is cruel. You are then inferring that within Islamic legislation that there's some cruelty in it, or brutality, or whatever it is, that is basically accusing Islam of committing injustice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, كُلُوا مِمَّا رَزَقَكُمُ اللَّهُ. The Prophet ﷺ had eaten mutton, had eaten goat, had eaten sheep, had eaten camel, etc. All of these things the Prophet ﷺ himself had done. If he is the role model for humanity, and you're calling him to had committed something that is cruel, then that is in itself kufr. Okay, so when it says وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, that's basically in ritual, in relationship to animals, that we have to be really careful and not get into this inspiration that would be coming from shaitan to deal with animals in a way that contradicts the legislation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given. And therefore follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what he had regarded as basically the right method. Okay, let's move on right there. إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. He is basically the enemy to you. But we're going to go right there and actually get to Tafseer al-Qurtubi. Here's the thing. Tafseer al-Qurtubi, I want you to look at it, because Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and he was saying that there are 23 different matters to talk about in regards to the tafsir of this ayah. Guess what? Most of that tafsir, most of these matters are actually just on this piece of it. وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. But because he's going to go in a lot of detail, I don't want to make it a fiqh class. I will try to summarize it and not go in all the details of their evidences and the whole debate. I'll just make the story short, okay? At least when I get to this one, I will cover each and every single point, but I will still try to summarize it as much as I can. Okay, let's see. The first point, قوله تعالى أنشأ. So the word ansha, remember in Lugha Arabiya, when we say ansha, that would basically mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that he had created out of nothing, that he had created basically out of nothing, and therefore recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created created these plants out of nothing. Therefore, that is the inference. Therefore, he should be the one that they would return in the details. So he's the resource. Then they should be getting the data. Two, they should be getting the interpretation and certainly the application coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's legislation. Remember the resource. Since he is the resource, then he would be the one that would have the right to legislate how this is basically consumed, how this is used in terms of amount, in terms of kind, and in terms of how it is also distributed. Okay, so in other words, it is supposed to be exclusive. Since he is the creator, that he would be the one that would have the right to basically determine how it is basically going to be used. Okay, so Jannat and Ma'rushat, the word Jannat, we said in Lugha Arabiya, the word Jannah or anything that contains the Jim and the Noon means something is hidden. So whether we're speaking about Janine, embryo in a woman's belly, that basically means it's hidden in her belly. If we're talking about Jinn, it's a hidden creature. Okay, so that would basically let us know that Jinn is a hidden creature. If we're talking about Jannat, we're talking about the abundance of plantations that's basically covering a lot of different things behind it. It can, just the greenery can be basically obstruct the view what is behind it. Ma'rushat, we talked. Now here's one thing: when you look at ma'rushat, does that mean that they are held, or does that mean they are risen? And some scholars, like Ali ibn Abi Talib, he actually had a qira'ah maghrusat wa ghayra maghrusat. Okay, hold on. So maghrusat. So he put a dot on the ghayn, on the ayn, and took out the three dots over the sheen and made it maghrusat wa ghayra maghrusat. Not ma'rushat, but maghrusat. Okay, what does maghrusat mean anyway? Maghrus means it's planted. غير مغروس means it is not planted deeply. So in other words, it's maghrus, meaning that it is planted in earth and it is deep with its roots. غير مغروسات, the roots are not too deep. Okay, the roots are not too deep. It's quite interesting. Okay, let's see right here. Ibn Abbas said, Ma'rushat is basically talking about the plants that would grow on earth, just like the different grape trees, and other plants that would grow down on earth. In other words, they would extend in that way, just like different plants, including watermelon. So you got, hold on, let's count those. You got watermelon, you got cucumbers. Okay, those are different plants that would grow on ground. And you can put them to grow upwards if you were to create, I don't know, what did you call that? What did you say that was called? Trellised? I don't know what that, I don't even know how to say it. Trellised? I don't know. Oh, teach me how to say it. Write it down in the chat. All right, teach me how to say it. I don't know. All right. And certainly, and by the way, there is an equivalent word in Surah Al-Rahman. وَالنَّجْمُ وَشَجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ. In Najm, some scholars actually said in Najm doesn't mean the stars, but in Najm, and since it was added to Ish-Shajar, in Najm is speaking about the plants that grow on ground. On ground, so just like cucumbers or perhaps a watermelon, those grow on ground. Or even if you were to leave the grape trees, if you don't raise them, give them a trellis or whatever it's called, okay, this kind of built, something to build on it, and then in that situation, it's going to keep on growing on ground. Okay, غير معروشات, basically the plants that grow on bark. Okay, they grow on a bark just like palm trees or even other trees. Okay, now here's one thing. You could see that scholars basically had differences of opinions on really what is it referring to marushat, but regardless, I mean, it's going to be short, okay? Whether it's the long trees or whether we're speaking about the ones that need to be elevated, or whether what people would raise or what people don't raise, or but basically what grows perhaps on plateaus or probably mountainous areas. So in the end, we would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just indicating the different types of trees, the different types of plantation. So if he had given you these different types of plantation and from one God Almighty, that's to let you know that he is being abundant in the different types of the different ways that they grow, in the different tastes, the different colors, the different the different kinds, different nutrients within it. All of that is to let you see beyond those plants of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create in terms of different ways and different means and different types, etc. And that's to let us also recognize when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about Jannah, he said that they would be given plants, and he said mutashabiha wa ghayra mutashabih. What do you mean mutashabih wa ghayra mutashabih? So in Jannah they're similar but they're different. I mean, yeah, so this is an apple, but you have different types of apples. You got green apples that taste different than the red apples. The apples Granny Smith taste completely different than perhaps the Pink Lady apple or Macintosh apples or whatever it is. Each one tastes a little different, but they're apples. Same thing if you're talking about bananas. Right here in Malaysia, I had seen the first time in my life bananas that are so small, never seen anything like it. I don't know, I wasn't intimidated to try it, but really small bananas, they were like half the size of my finger. Really small bananas. I mean, in Palestine, we call that Abu Namle, but Abu Namle is a little larger than this pinky size banana, but whatever. And there are all these big bananas that you grow in Brazil, really long bananas, okay, that you don't have here. Okay, they're bananas, but they're different bananas. Okay, they taste different, and certainly the texture is different, and certainly the way that they would use it, based on the texture, based on all of that, they would use it differently. Okay, at the end of the day, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that just as you would have these variant produce, these variant creations, these variant provisions in this dunya, okay, have all these number of different beautiful tastes. How is the Jannah going to be like? And that's what Ibn al-Qayyim, he would get that inspiration a lot in his book to tell us, when you see this dunya and how beautiful it is, just think of the Jannah. When you taste a beautiful meal, think of Jannah and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you. If this is what this dunya would taste like, what would Jannah look like? What would Jannah taste like? What would Jannah appear like? If this beautiful dunya, you would see beautiful scenery and water and beautiful scenery and probably in gardens, etc. If that's dunya, how is Jannah going to be like? Okay, وَالنَّخْلَ وَالزَّرْعَ, and of course we talked about nakhl, and he wanted to say, well, the Qurtubi at least, that they're actually included in the word jannat. So since it was included in the word jannat, it was mentioned as al-fadila. What is al-fadila? Al-fadila, to basically express their importance, to express their honor, to express, just like in Surah Al-Baqarah, to express their blessings. And what kind of a blessing that they would have in it? What? In nakhl. So in nakhl, palm trees were basically put as if they were on their own, equivalent to all the other plants. In nakhl on its own. On its own is like one plant in its weight, in its importance, in its value, equivalent to a lot of these plants. Well, of course, you're not just going to live on dates, but this is the emphasis. Is this emphasis because that's what their life depended on? That was the main resource, at least for the Arab at that time. The answer is possibly that was the resource that they had as basically the key thing that they would live on. And that was to emphasize, to let them see it. In other words, perhaps in other countries, you're probably going to talk about potatoes, or you're probably going to talk about in other countries, maybe, whatever plant that grows in their area. Here they have something, what is that called? That's the thing, that thorny type of thing, smells weird. Durian. Here they have durian, and I didn't try it. I smelled it and something just feels weird about it. Durian. And I was not intimidated to try it. Maybe one day I'll close my eyes and close my nose and just perhaps try it. I was told it tastes like a combination of, what was that? I was told it was a combination of mango and pineapple. I mean, I love both, but I don't know, that smell within that durian was really weird. Okay, let's see. So tell me what you think of durian. Did you ever try it? Tell me what you think. All right, let's see. مختلفا أكله, meaning, what is الأكل? الأكل, right here, this is the word right there. الأكل actually means the taste. Taste is different, different taste. And let's look into this ayah right there. So now it's giving me different types of classifications. The first classification, the way it grows. The second type of classification is the taste. The third classification is that they are similar and different in ways. Well, I mean, that's a very broad word. Okay, very broad word. What are other classifications in the different ayat? Color. So some of it is green and some of it different colors. Other classifications, at least in the Quran, it was giving us also different types of the way it grows. So we got al-najm, al-shajar, different ways of how it grows, right? Can go in further ayat and really see different kinds of classification that the ayat are giving us. But right now, let's focus on this one. مختلفا أكله, they have different tastes. And of course, طعمه جيد, and certainly some of it doesn't necessarily taste good. And وسماه أكلا لأنه يؤكل. Said it was called ukulan because it is to be eaten. You can eat it. Okay. Ukuluhu, I'm going to skip some of that he was talking about. I'm just going to focus on the area that would probably relate more to tafsir than the grammar of it. Because if I was going to talk about the grammar, I would really fail in doing so in English, to be honest. Okay, because I don't think we have an equivalent structure in English compared to the Arabic one. The structure is very different because remember, Arabic has its own grammar and it has its own structure, and it's not like if you were to compare Italian perhaps to French, well, they come from the same resource, so you can have a lot of similarities, okay, between Italian and French, for example, or Spanish, etc., because they come from Italian. Okay, but if you were to compare Arabic to Italian, that's a completely different structure, a completely different root, and a completely different semantic. Okay, but if you were to compare Arabic to Hebrew, you're going to find a lot of similarities. Arabic, Hebrew, and Syriac, those are going to Aramaic. They have the same foundation because they're all Semitic languages. Okay, so you're going to be finding a lot of commonalities. If you were to compare, you understand what I'm talking about. Okay, let's say. So in the end, فاعلم أنه أنشأها مختلفا أكلها. The whole thing is that خالق كل شيء, just like in Surah Al-Zumar, that he is the creator of everything. So know that he had created them with multiple tastes. And therefore, he had given he was the one to give the amount. So he's basically letting us see, well, you see the inference. If he was capable of giving a result to be in such a way, then he is the one that controls the resources. He was capable of controlling the resource of the amount of nutrients, even though it's all coming from the same soil, but this tree basically makes a taste that is sour. This tree makes a taste that is sweet. That tree makes and in fact, the same tree might actually have one fruit sour and the other fruit is probably maybe sweet and the other one is probably this. So depending on whether the stage of its when it's getting ripe, or probably even within the month and within its growth and etc. And then of course the time of harvest, all of that is basically to tell us and let us know. Since he gives you the result of a different taste, then he basically is the one to control the resources to make this. Okay, that's the same thing. That's the same thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know. Since he is the one to give the resources, then he's the one to basically make the result. And since he is the one to make the result, he is the one that has the right to channel where this is going and how this was supposed to be basically consumed in, how it was supposed to be distributed, and what is fair in how the provision is done. So in other words, just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us see that the resources to make the different things in nature grow in ways that is to bring about various benefits. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that the resources and how they would be distributed was actually supposed to be giving and covering the benefits in different ways. So if this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had done in justice in nature, then that's the same thing, the justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would do in legislature. Justice in nature, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you see it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking you to apply the justice in legislature, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only determine and would only create, or would only what is the word that I could use, would only judge, or would only order, or would only regulate in a way that contains justice. In other words, that would bring the fruit of everything, that would bring the provision and the best of everything, since he basically created all these different rules and different laws and different paths to basically make this world in nature bring the best of it. Well, that's the same thing in terms of legislature. The Lord Almighty would only rule what is the best of everything, and therefore your free will should submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. Because remember, there is the will that is tashri'i, and there's the will that is kawni, or basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in this universe. Okay, al-mashi'a al-tashri'iyya wal-mashi'a al-kawniyya, the will that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put in legislation, in the will, and وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ, and the will that he had created basically in nature. Okay, let's see right there. The third thing is that he basically wanted to say is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in multiple tastes, that's in order to tell us that لو كان له أكل لكان مختلفا أكله. Okay. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know that with the multiple tastes, what you would get is recognizing that the resource may be one, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of giving different results. So just because somebody is going through a certain path and probably living the life in a certain way, that each one is basically going through a completely different experience. Completely different experience. Even though it could be one resource, but a completely different experience. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know. And subhanAllah, you know, it's quite interesting. When you speak about things in physics, chemistry, biology, it's so easy to study them in patterns. But when you study human beings, we're not talking about, you know, the way that their body functions, but we're also talking about human behavior. Studying human behavior and studying people is a lot more complex than studying things in biology or studying things in physics, etc., because they would follow a certain paradigm. They would follow a certain rule. You're not going to see it different unless it's an exception to a certain rule. Okay. Yet human beings, you can have a certain profile. 9 brothers and sisters, they grew up in the same household, but each one has his own character. This one is mean, this one is selfish, this one is giving, hospitable, that one is nice, that one is a comedian, the other one, nothing will make them laugh. The third one, they're basically so just giving, and the third one is basically just wanting everything to himself. The fourth one, he's really active. You give him any task, boom, right there, they're finishing it right away. The third one, you give him a task, it's like the end of the world. It's like the end of the world. Oh, the task is a mission impossible. There's no way that they can do it. What happens, you know, you could see just different akhlaq, even though it's the same household, but you could see different personalities. And this is extremely important to recognize. You know, people have different personalities, even if they can actually be from one father, one mother, one household. They'd be eating the same food. They would be living under the same roof, but each one is a completely different personality. So when you look at that, is it as a result of the food? Is it a result of probably their line within the family? Is it a result of their own certain characteristics and own features? Wait a minute. So what do you say own features? What are you talking about? Remember the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ tells al-Mundhir ibn al-Ashaj ibn Qais, when he tells him, you have traits that Allah and His Messenger love. He said, what are they? And he said, al-hilmu wal-ana. Al-hilmu wal-ana. Forbearance and gentleness. And he said, are they traits that I had created in myself? In other words, disciplined myself into, or are they traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in me? He said, but they're actually traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in you. What is that an indication of? That's an indication that there are certain features that may be controlled or may be created within you. So if you are smart, well, that's not because you just happen to be so good at it and just figured everything out. It's basically a provision from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the same thing. If you happen to be active, well, good for you. Certainly, you did put in perhaps a number of different physical practices to probably get you into activism, but it's also that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you certain things that triggered this to be within you. If you happen to be a person of perhaps maybe hospitality, yes, it's probably something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within you. And can I discipline myself into that? Yes, you can discipline yourself into that. But people that basically had it, let's say they were, the whole family is just known for their hospitality. The whole family is just known for their selfishness. You could say that, you know, it becomes organic to them, right? The whole family, they're all doctors. The whole family, they're all engineers, whatever it is, okay? It's basically, you could say that it's a built-in structure. So when you look at built-in structure, What does that have to do with all of that? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that whether we're speaking about animals or whether we're speaking about plants, that we can learn about nature. We can learn about human beings, by looking at things in nature. By looking at things in nature. You can learn about human behavior. You can learn about what to change in human behavior by looking at things and how they're channeled basically in their creation in nature. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would let us see some things in nature. Some people, they just have a type of nature that, just like you look at even animals. Some people, no, they will refuse to just be on ground. They always want to aim up high, just like goats. They will aim up high no matter what it is. Some people have the nature of eagles. They've got their territory. They will not accept that anybody goes into their territory. And some people are just like pigs. They know no ghaira over their wives or over their family. No ghaira. They will live on filth. Nothing of any hygiene. Filth is what they enjoy. Some are like that. And some, they will be as clean and they cannot handle any dirt. No, even water to them is just like cats. They will just continue just cleaning themselves. It's like, oh, they can't handle any filth. Even the area that they would potty in, it's like, oh, it has to be clean. If it's not clean, I'm not gonna do it there. And even when they use the bathroom, they will dig a hole and make sure that it's all covered up, clean for others too. And others, no, they will just right there, just make it in the face of everyone, etc. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us see some of the akhlaq that you would get from whether from وما من طائر يطير بجناحيه وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمم أمثالكم. So what do we get? Whether animals walking on earth or whether birds, you would say, okay, what traits can we learn from all of that? Okay, والزيتون والرمان. الزيتون is basically olives. الزيتون, olives, and even olives, they're not the same, by the way. There are different types of olives. Okay, why is zaytun? Zaytun basically grows for hundreds of years. Some plants, they're just very seasonal. It's just for 2 months, 3 months, and that's it. They won't renew. Lifespan is short. Other plants, 18 years, 20 years, peach plants, peach trees. Other plants, a little bit longer, 30, 40 years. Other plants, no. Zaytun grows for hundreds of years. We have in Palestine olive trees that are hundreds of years old. They would be really huge, and their bark is absolutely huge. In other plants, they basically would, that's it. Their lifespan is way shorter than that. Rumman is also a plant that can also have a long lifespan as well, but not as much as zaytun. Definitely not as much as that. Rumman is, pomegranates are actually hard to grow because they're really particular about the amount of water that is used in basically growing pomegranates. Not going to talk about it. Zaytun, you don't have to do much to keep that tree. It can live on a short amount of water and give you a lot of olives, and different kinds of olives. You got the black olives, you got the green olives, and even the green olives, they're different types. And the black olives, they're different types of olives. And even the oil that they produce, they're different. In Palestine, for example, the farther you go up north, the less extra virgin olive oil you'll get. So it's lighter in color. The south you go, the more south, and Hebron is the greenest and the heaviest extra virgin olive oil you'll get. So Al-Khalil gets the very dark type extra virgin olive oil. You go up further north, you would get light extra virgin olive oil. It's extra virgin olive oil, but it's not really that dark and condensed. I'm from Al Khalil, so I like the very condensed olive oil and the kind that really is, when you first squeeze it, it's kind of murky. And when it has a little spicy taste, that's the best olive oil. We eat it with za'atar, eat it with thyme, and man, that's heavenly. With hot bread, freshly baked bread, that's heavenly right there. متشابه هو غير متشابه. It's basically متشابه, similar and different. Let's see, he says, and there are three different signs in that. He said, one, it's basically a sign how things may change and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that makes things change. Okay. The second, he said, it's basically to indicate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings upon us. And if he were to choose to just create us without needing food, he would have done so. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created us to let us recognize the different provisions, to enjoy life, to basically enjoy the different tastes, and therefore making also perhaps maybe picking the plants and picking all those different resources to let us see what good investment might look like. So you invest in a certain amount of activity, you will put in a certain amount of effort to make this grow, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you, with this amount of effort, will give you a number of plants, even though you just planted 2 seeds. And that's in order to let us know and get the inspiration that you might invest 2 rak'ahs of Qiyam al-Layl, but those 2 rak'ahs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you plants, a number of different plants in Jannah. You probably invested Hifd al-Quran or Qira'at al-Quran, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised you gardens and gardens in Jannah. You just did one little piece of act, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises to give you in return for this effort that you had invested a lot, just like you would invest in this dunya a small amount of effort, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you a whole tree for these 2 things that you probably had put in the ground, probably 2 seeds. And the other thing, I like the way that al-Qurtubi said this one. Let's see. He said, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to indicate is that even though it's one water, and water is supposed to be basically going downwards, and of course, basically going downwards, in other words, gravity, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting this water go upwards in order to basically get sucked into the trees, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had let this water basically go into the trunk, go up into the plants and fruits, and go all that way to give you basically what is necessary in terms of nutrients to keep that plant basically rich in the nutrients that are necessary for you. And he was basically looking at it, and he said, well, that's to let us see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of reversing different laws in order to give you the provisions. That's quite interesting. Reversing different laws, reversing different things that may seem to you that this is the only direction it should go, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know that he will reverse, and he controls how rizq basically comes to you. So you would think that, well, water only goes downwards, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reversing how water is sucked in through. Of course, we know, we study in basically biology and what makes that water go in a different direction, and how it goes up through the trunk and all the way through the leaves, and how it basically then travels all the way to the plants and all the way to the fruit. Okay. But al-Qurtubi wanted to see, of course, not necessarily just how it functions, but wanted to see the inspiration that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is designing this whole nature in order to basically serve us. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is serving us in those methods, then just get the inspiration that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is serving us in different provisions, even in ways that we may think is impossible. Even if you may think it is impossible, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reverses and may create different channels that may appear to you as impossible, but to the Lord Almighty, it is not impossible, for He is the one that controls how rizq travels. He's the one that controls how rizq travels. And therefore, you just put in the investment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to basically create everything, because He had created everything in complete one, whether we're speaking about amount or whether we're speaking about tartib, in other words, or whether we're speaking about the way it is organized. And this is extremely important. So your brother might be a rich person, the other brother is probably not a rich person. You might think it's, I just know how to make money. I just know how to, get to knowing how to make business, etc. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know that you put in effort, but the effort is not necessarily what brings you the provision. Provision is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You put in effort. Same thing. You put an effort to get an A score on your test. You put an effort, but don't expect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give you an A or give you basically a grade that you didn't work hard for. That's the same thing for each and every single thing. You put an effort and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the reward for it. You put an effort in this dunya and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the reward for it in Jannah. And certainly you put an effort, whether in depriving yourself from certain things or whether in making certain things. Why? Depriving yourself from muharramat. Things may be exciting, but then you deprive yourself of it because you wanted to enrich yourself with other types of nutrients. Okay, let's see. And here he said, in the relationship between this ayah and the previous ayat, that the disbelievers, when they had created the blasphemy and attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they had associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they had regarded certain things as halal or prohibited other things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them the sign of His oneness, that He is the creator of all things, and that He had given everything basically the provision. So whether it's the amount of water, whether it's the amount of nutrients, whether it's the amount of light that is needed, etc., in order to make it grow. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting them see, well, if He was the one that designed all the different needed resources in order to get to those provisions, to get to those arzaq, then He would be the one that has the right to legislate. If He was the one that had given these intricate provisions designed in a way to bring about the best resources, the best results, then in that situation, He would be the one that would have the right to legislate all the other matters in order to bring about the best result there as well. كُلُوا مِنْ ثَمَرِهِ إِذَا أَثْمَرَ وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. So what is that supposed to mean? كُلُوا مِنْ ثَمَرِهِ. Does that mean we have to eat? Because in Lugha Arabiya, كُلُوا is a فعل أمر. It's an imperative verb. Okay? An imperative verb. So what does that mean? So if we are to say this is an imperative verb, does that mean it's obligatory? The answer is it's not necessarily obligatory, because at the end, we would look at the context. Sometimes the context, and sometimes something called basically the other words that would take it from being obligatory, an imperative verb, to mean obligatory, to another state of mubah or permissible. Okay? And that would be a qarina. What is a qarina? Qarina would be another word that would be indicative that it takes it all the way from the level of being obligatory to a lower level, probably recommended, to perhaps a lower level to make it as permissible. So in this situation, that is indicating that it's permissible to eat from these on a condition that there would be no israf, that there would be no misuse. We're going to talk about the misuse later on, inshallah. Just like, for example, the ayah, فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they're supposed to be basically leaving work, leaving any form of business during Salat Al-Jumu'ah. And then after Salat Al-Jumu'ah, he said, فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, spread on earth. Does that mean here's that imperative verb? Does that mean I have to go and actually do business right after Salat Al-Jumu'ah? No, because this leaves it as basically mubah. It's permissible to do business after Salat Al-Jumu'ah and is not obligatory. Okay? And certainly this is that qarina, and that's what al-Qurtubi wanted to talk about. It doesn't mean if you were to have an imperative verb and within a sentence that sometimes you can have another word that basically takes it from being an imperative verb to mean wajib, to mean obligatory, to basically take it all the way down at the scale to make it permissible. Okay, so we just need to recognize that. Now, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. Now, you see this وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ? From point 5 to point 23, well, 22, okay? It's just talking about آتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. Here's the thing. What's the point here? آتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. I'm not going to explain it right now because there's a lot to say. I'm going to tell you what is coming up next of what we're really discussing. آتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. This surah is a surah that is Makkiyah. But we know zakah wasn't obligatory except in Medina. So is this ayah, or at least is this portion, basically telling us that this is infering to zakah, that we have to give in zakah? And does this mean that there's zakah on pomegranates, on olives, on probably, I don't know, peas and beans and all, probably the different produce that we have? Is there zakah on that? Can we give zakah before it ripens? What happens if we basically had an estimate, but then all of a sudden, hey, something happened, who knows, maybe, something happened, natural destruction basically affected all those plants, and now we can't do the zakah. Does that mean this is the end of it? What do we have to do in that situation? And what about zakah? Do we pay zakah on every type of a plant? Or is it exclusive to the types of plants that can be saved? So things like grapes made into raisins, or probably maybe dates made into some type of can be saved in different ways. Are we talking about those, or maybe other plants that can be dried, like lentils, like peas? Or what about things that perish fast? You can't really save those. What about those? Do we make the zakah once they are still fresh, or do we make the zakah when they had dried? Do we wait until they dry, or do we make zakah just on, experts would estimate, they would look at the tray and say, this basically almost has 600 kilos or whatever it is. And then they say, okay, this is how much you pay in zakah. Can we do that? Or do we know we have to go and actually harvest all of that and then put it on the scale and actually weigh it and say, this is how much of zakah we have to give? What does that look like? And basically, just going to those details of atu haqqahu yawma hasadihi, we're going to get into those differences of opinions between scholars. What did they base that on? What is the difference of opinions between scholars on that? So that's what we'll be talking about next week. Or, on Tuesday, is it? Yeah, so it's going to be in a couple of days. Because tomorrow we have fiqh of marriage, and so is the day after. Well, the day after that, the day after tomorrow. Okay, fiqh of marriage as well. So we got 2 days of fiqh of marriage, and then we get back to our tafsir. If there are any questions in the meantime, I'd be happy to answer it, inshallah. If there are any comments as well, be happy to listen to it. You can just unmute yourselves, and hopefully we can. You don't want to unmute yourself.